Hello, everyone. How's everybody doing today? I think we can get a stronger response here. How's everyone doing? Yeah, excellent. Yes, yay, spring. Oh, thank goodness. Well, my name is Margie Cook. I'm part of the team that brings you live from NYPL. And again, I want to welcome everyone watching right now, both here in the room and tuning in online. Tonight, we are thrilled to welcome essayist, memoirist, and journalist Daisy Hernández. Over the past 2 decades, her remarkable body of work has explored the intersections of race, ethnicity, immigration, class, and sexuality. She joins us this evening in conversation with New York Times journalist Jia Lynn Yang. You can find their full bios in your printed programs or on the event listing on our website. Daisy Hernández's new book, Citizenship: Notes on an American Myth, offers a provocative and deeply personal examination of one of the most complicated subjects in contemporary life and politics, citizenship. As Sandra Cisneros writes in her blurb for the book, how did "give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free" turn upside down to where we are today? Hernández explores this question by providing the context we need to understand why our ideas about citizenship can be so easily destabilized. Through historical examples, social critique, and reflections from her own life, she shows that citizenship has functioned not only as a promise of belonging, but also as a powerful tool of exclusion. Citizenship is available for purchase here outside the room and through our online shop for those attending virtually. However you choose to buy it, and we encourage you to, if you're able, proceeds support the New York Public Library. And for those of you here in person, there will be a book signing after the event. And for our online audience, we'll drop a purchase link in the chat if we haven't already. And of course, if you have a New York Public Library card, which I assume all of you do, you can borrow the book for free. So before we continue, I'd love to tell you about a few upcoming programs. Tomorrow, there is still time to register for our event with Bob Crawford and Alexis Coe. Historian and bassist for the Avid Brothers, Bob Crawford revisits the life of John Quincy Adams in his new book, America's Founding Son. On Tuesday, March 24th, join us for a screening of the documentary Sala. The film tells the remarkable story of Sala Garnsarch Kirchner, a teenager who survived the Holocaust in 7 Nazi labor camps, and went on to build a life of resilience and hope. The screening will be followed by a panel discussion with the filmmakers, Sala's daughter Anne Kirchner, and moderator Annette Isensdorf. And on Wednesday, March 25th, acclaimed Irish writer Fintan O'Toole delivers the annual Robert B. Silvers Lecture, The Idiocy of Greatness, presented in partnership with the New York Review of Books. We hope you'll join us for these and more. And one last thing, when you entered the auditorium, you should have received an index card. Please use that index card to write down any questions you have. A staff member will collect them during the program. Live from NYPL is made possible by the continuing generosity of Celeste Bartos, Manaz Isfahani Bartos, and Adam Bartos, and of course by all of you, our wonderful supporters and friends near and far. Thank you for that support, and thank you all again for being here. And now please join me in welcoming Daisy Hernández and Jia Lynn Yang.
Good evening, everyone. Daisy, it's wonderful to be here with you and all of you out in our audience on this beautiful spring evening in New York. I want to start by saying congratulations on your powerful new book. It's beautifully written, morally urgent, and I think it offers a badly needed perspective as we live through this time. And as I was reading it, I was struck that we talk a lot about immigration. We hear our political leaders talk a lot about it. But I think the questions that you raise in your book that are quite profound struck me as questions that we really don't ask very often, certainly in public. So I appreciate that as a reader, as a person in this country, and then I just would love to dig in with you to hear more so we can all learn more from you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for being in conversation with me tonight. I really appreciate it.
So let's start with your own journey as an author. Your last book, The Kissing Bug, really weaves together memoir, history, politics, And I think this book brings a similar kind of approach. What brought you to citizenship as the subject that you wanted to tackle next?
Yeah, so I grew up just across the river in New Jersey in an immigrant family. My mother is from Colombia. My father's a political refugee from Cuba. I had an uncle from Peru, another uncle from Puerto Rico, friends from Mexico and Argentina and Guatemala. So I like to say I grew up in the United Nations of Latinos, located in New Jersey. So citizenship has been at the center of my life for a really long time. And when I was working on the last book, which is about this parasitic disease called Chagas that disproportionately here in the US afflicts Latino immigrants, the question came up around how folks access medical care when they don't have citizenship or when they have legal residency. And it really raised a question for me about at what point and how did we decide that citizenship would be necessary in order to access things like Medicaid federal funding. So I wanted to answer that question in a lot of ways, that kind of specific question, but then this broader question that it's tied to, which is in 1986, when I was in middle school, we passed amnesty. Congress passed legislation that made it possible for 3 million people to become citizens. And now 4 decades later, we are like violently persecuting immigrant families and their allies. So it's like, in just my short lifetime, it's been such a dramatic change. And I wanted to understand how that had happened. Yeah. Hence this book.
Yeah. So you write about how citizenship is a story, a fiction. What does that mean?
That means that when I started this book, I was thinking of citizenship as many of us do. It's a status, it's fixed. You either have it or you don't have it. But in reality, citizenship has changed so much over the history of our country. And you write about this so beautifully in your own book, which I really loved and encourage you all to read. But just as early as 1790, you couldn't naturalize in the US unless you were a free white immigrant. And that was something that was decided by courts, not by you. You didn't go in and say, I consider myself to be white, hence I would like to naturalize. Less than 100 years later, we had a civil war, which obviously to abolish slavery, but also to determine the citizenship of Black Americans. It gave us the 14th Amendment. During that time period, we ended up also in the 1800s having the Chinese Exclusion Act, which limited citizenship for so many people from Asian countries. Early 20th century, citizenship changed again. And if you were a woman and you married a foreigner, you ran the risk of losing your citizenship. They revised it for a little bit and said, okay, you can marry a foreigner as long as they're not from these Asian countries, right? So it has just changed to meet the political moment that we're in, and not only in terms of racial exclusion or gender exclusion, but also to expand what citizenship can mean, right? So when we talk about the civil rights movement, gay liberation movement, all these like really important social justice movements of the mid-20th century, these were all folks who had been born here, not all, but you know what I mean, they were here, and yet their actual social citizenship, what they could do was so limited, and so these social justice movements really expanded the possibility of what was possible for someone who had birthright citizenship. So I would like to remind us that even in these moments of despair, we are still the authors of the story of citizenship.
And you write about how different countries, different societies over time have just had a different conception. Maybe walk us through that, because I feel like it's even, it's so hard to jostle loose out of our modern conception of what it means. So help us understand, what are other ways to imagine citizenship?
Well, going all the way back to Aristotle, our friend Aristotle, I was so surprised to find out that he was not a citizen of ancient Athens. Isn't that like incredible to you? That was really incredible to me. As I write in the book, he's basically like my uncle, who had a green card here. I think he basically had the equivalent of green card in ancient Athens, different names. He was considered a metic, M-E-T-I-C. He was considered to, basically have like a privileged position in that society, but he was not considered to be a citizen. He didn't have citizen parents, which was the requirement in that time period. So going from there and just like my uncle, to fast forward, in Colombia, my mother's country, citizenship, a lot of people have been saying, repeating some of what the Trump administration has been saying, oh, most countries don't have birthright citizenship. Actually, pretty much every country in the Western Hemisphere does have birthright citizenship. He's often referring to Europe when he's making that reference, except for Colombia, which does not have birthright citizenship. And so in Colombia, if you are born there, you do not have citizenship unless your parent is a Colombian citizen, which was not a problem historically because Colombia is not the United States. You don't have a huge immigrant population there, except recently because of the situation in Venezuela. So in 2022, Colombia woke up and realized, oh, we have more than 20,000 children who are stateless because they were born to Venezuelan mothers. So it had to pass legislation to basically take that into account and to find a way for them to not be stateless in Colombia. So we have a lot of lessons from ancient times to also modern times of what could happen here.
Yeah. And then in the US, you write about how the 90s, which I think most of us in this room were alive for, right? Really changes how we think about citizenship. And you're even tracking how many books have the word citizenship. The way we talk about it has changed, even within our lifetimes. Tell us more about what is it about the 90s that feels like we're living in the shadow of those changes?
Absolutely. I always have to preface telling you about the 90s by explaining that I was actually procrastinating working on my book. And so I thought to myself, let me see how many books in the Library of Congress are about citizenship. And it led me down this complete rabbit hole to realize that the 1990s is when you see this huge boom in books, scholarly books about citizenship. And so there's a couple of reasons why that might be the case. By the 1990s, we've come out of the aftermath of World War II, which means that we have a lot more countries on the planet than we did before, right? We have decolonization that has created more countries. We have the Soviet Union situation breaking up as well. So we literally just have more countries, more citizens. The member states of the UN, dramatically increases. We also have globalizations, right? So countries are now going corporations are going to all different parts of the world, and it becomes a question. Well, if you're impacted by the actions of a corporation in one country it's headquartered in New York City, but you are a citizen of El Salvador, where do you take your complaint to, right? Is it to your own government? Is it to the government of this company, et cetera? And what we see in 1996 is really dramatic legislation in this country, both specifically about immigration and also about welfare. So immigration legislation that was passed that year for the first time really took away the kind of powers that an immigration judge had in terms of looking at the specifics of your case. So now they were obligated to deport you. This created also expedited removal, which many of us know about, where you're just immediately removed from the country. It also made certain misdemeanors that would never have been considered as making you eligible for deportation. Now they made you eligible for deportation. So you had a green card, you stole a video game 10 years prior, or you stole some flu medicine at the store. Now that could make you eligible for deportation. So really drastic penalties, right? Which changed the landscape. And then in terms of welfare, for the first time, it said, if you have a green card, for example, you can no longer access the safety net in this country, at least at the federal level. So you have a green card, you have to wait 5 years before you qualify for Medicaid federal dollars, unless you live in a state that wants to use its own Medicaid dollars. And so part of what I talk about in the book as well is that we are less a citizen of one country right now than we are a citizen of the state in which we live. And anyone in the room who's a woman or who's thought about pregnancy, you know that very dramatically because your access to reproductive care in New York City is very different than what you would get in Alabama or Florida or Texas right now.
It also feels like what you're describing actually sounds a lot like right now, right? That all of these, we're hearing when you hear about these individual cases, oh, well, they just had only had a green card, oh, it's only a student visa, and suddenly you're just sent into a completely different experience.
And scholars, and the legal scholars have been telling us about this for years, right? That this is a huge change in how we envision Americans and citizenship, because people with green cards were historically thought of as Americans in waiting, as citizens in waiting. There's a wonderful book by a legal scholar, literally called Americans in Waiting, that's all about this. And so the conceptualization, what you see in 1996 is, especially around welfare reform, is now that it's a non-citizen and a citizen, right? As opposed to all these gradations that we were recognizing before.
And is that because there's a sense that if we can just make life, we, the people in charge of all this, if we can make life more miserable for people of different status, that might change who's coming in? Is that the logic behind that?
Yeah, part of what happened with legislation in 1965, I think a lot of people are familiar with immigration legislation in 1965, did away with those racial and racist quotas on who could come in. And so the racial demographics of this country have dramatically changed. By the 1990s, it's the flip of what it was before, where now majority immigrants are Asian and Latino. There's no longer that kind of deportation mechanism that was there in place before 1965, right? That racial exclusion. So you have policymakers trying to dramatically control that, as well as, remember the 1970s? I was born in the 1970s, but you also have in the 1970s, just an economic downturn. And you have suddenly also attacks on the welfare system to explain that as well, right? So you have Reagan coming in. By the time he gets into office in 1980, he's really talking about, welfare queens, and basically what is a welfare queen? It's an anti-citizen, right? And the model of the model citizen should not need the government in any way. And blaming poor people has just historically always been the go-to explain when you need to explain why there's so much inequity happening for a lot of people.
Yeah. And it sounds like during this time, this is also when, not being a citizen, not having the right papers turns into the same as being a criminal.
Yeah.
Right. And so is that also a fairly recent phenomenon and shift? In other words, we used to just not see that great a distinction. Certainly not without citizenship. You're basically on the verge of being a criminal. Where does that come from?
Yeah, you literally start to see it in the congressional debates leading up to these 1996, particularly the Welfare Reform Act, where you're basically, literally there's headings that say, felons and non-citizens, things like that, where basically the implication is that they are felons or criminals in some ways. Yeah.
You write very movingly also about political disagreement within your own family. And I think we know there's a long history of immigrants who are not terribly pro-immigrant.
That's a great way to say that. I love that.
Anyone with an immigrant family knows what I'm talking about. So, and it's ever been this way. Irish immigrant. It's just there's a pattern here. What have you observed yourself? I mean, you share so movingly about your own family, and what do you think is behind this psychology?
Yeah, in my Cuban-American family, I have seen now every generation complains about the generation that comes right after, right? So people who've been here 50 years complain about the folks that got here 30 years ago. The people that got here 20 years ago complain about the folks that got here 2 years ago. Folks who got here last year complaining about the folks that got here last week. I do think there should be some psychologist out there that does some deep analysis about this. But in my own family, I write about, having to recognize that people also come to this country, really carrying intense political stories. And so I give the example of one of my cousins who was imprisoned in Cuba for being gay. He is not, at the time that I was writing this book, not a citizen, but was really hoping that Trump would win in this election, and couldn't understand me and my politics. He says, you're the daughter of a Cuban and a Colombian. How can you be a leftist? He's outraged by that. But he's really afraid of a repeat of a communist or even socialist government rising up. He saw it happen in his country, and he's afraid that it'll happen here. And what I write in the book, that I had to go through a journey myself of, I went through a journey of having conversations with him, because that's what we're encouraged to do right now. We're in a time of political division, and so we should have conversations with those that we disagree with. So we had conversations. And you can read the book to see what happened in those conversations. But part of what I began to recognize was just how much privilege certain family members have and how much they want to hold on to that. And so my cousin might be gay, way. He might have been through an incredibly traumatic experience. He's also a man, and he's a white man, and he has a very nice life here in the US. And he wants to protect it in a certain way, and he felt like Trump was the one who was promising to protect that lifestyle. I write about my dad in similar ways too. My dad was very racist and really saw himself as a white man in this country and voted Republican his entire life. He wanted to actually send Trump for this last campaign, wanted to send his campaign $1,000 contribution. And I write in the book about how subversive our different family members can be. So my mother was in charge of the family money. So he had to go to my mother to make the request. I want to send Trump $1,000. Send the check. And my mother said, sure. And then she conveniently forgot all about it and definitely did not send a check. But as I write, it's not because she had any political opposition to Trump. It was simply because she was opposed to sending any politician $1,000. That was her moral principle on that matter. But I had to recognize there's a book called Dying of Whiteness that I found really, really helpful too. It's a doctor who goes to different parts of the South and the Midwest to kind of understand why people vote, why it looks to us like people are voting against themselves, and they're not. They're voting for their interests, and it can be a really hard process for us to recognize that, like, I might not have the same interests as the man who's my father or the cousin that that I care so much about.
That reminds me too that you're also writing in the book, I think when we do sort of broad demographic political analysis, it's the Latino vote, and you also describe really nicely in your book just how much we're not understanding these racial differences within the Latino population, and without that, you kind of don't really know who or what you're talking about, too.
Yeah, absolutely. I talk about, the Latino that you imagine, and so, because oftentimes people can't imagine someone like my cousin. They're like, wait, he's gay and he's a Latino and he's supporting Trump? That doesn't make any sense. And he's not a citizen, right? But I'm like, oh, you're like imagining a brown person crossing the desert or the river who's very disenfranchised, in many different ways. And that's not my cousin, actually.
Yeah. How is this cousin feeling these days?
Spoken.
Okay. I had to ask. You have to ask after what we've seen.
But I will say that other family members, he's obviously not the only family member who is supporting Trump. Other family members have been, as one family member said about Trump, ya se pasó, like now he's gone too far. And my mother, who supported Trump in this last election, has also been, I think going through her own journey of feeling shocked at how people are being treated, how immigrants and their allies are being treated, and that has definitely been a big shock to her. And I have someone else, another family friend, who was like, who believed the political rhetoric and thought, and literally said to me, they were supposed to only go after criminals. But again, this comes back to like, we start the history of using that category of criminal. We see this like going back to the 1800s, where after the Civil War, right, Black Americans were suddenly criminalized and referred to as criminals as a way to still control that community. And so you see that conflation now again happening with immigrants. But it's hard to tell somebody, they don't mean it when someone believes really that they mean it.
Yeah. And back to the idea that if you are undocumented and you're here, you are by definition a criminal. Yeah. Right. Just
and
your lack of status is itself breaking. I mean, you hear this, I think, from Democrats sometimes too. It's like,
oh, absolutely.
There's no rule of law.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
And so when you hear that, what strikes you about that argument?
Yeah, it's a very difficult argument to push against, because you can use the logic of like, actually, it's not criminal to be in the U.S. without certain documents. It might have been criminal to not cross at a port of entry, or to not have the paper, or to have a fake paper when you did that. But just existing is not criminal in and of itself. I think that actually right now, part of what I said to people, I don't think I have to say it as much as that people are witnessing that, like, when you see someone being dragged away from their 5-year-old, that's not your concept of what a criminal is. But it is a really tough it's like a tough political argument to get around, because I think it's so easy to tap into people's fears. And so when they hear criminal, they hear someone is out to get them, someone is out to do something terrible to them. They're not thinking about the father dropping his 5-year-old at kindergarten, right? That's not what they're thinking of. But once you open the door to any community being labeled by criminality, then you're just opening the door for, fascist leaders to rise and to use power in really brutal ways.
And I think it's also about this kind of loss of control, right? If you can't control the border, if you can't control who can be here. And so what do you think makes it so hard for people to think of citizenship the way you're trying to describe? What's holding us back from seeing through? I think the legal language does so much work here, right? And so what holds us back from understanding it the way that you've come to understand it?
Well, people, part of it is people say, people will say, like, you want open borders. And I'm like, we already have open borders. American companies can go across any border. It's really open for them. Our foreign policy crosses all borders. Right? So yeah, there's no border for what Trump can do. So I simply want fairness. If they can cross borders, then so should people be allowed to cross borders. But part of the challenge, and you and I were talking about this, or I was sharing this before, is that the image and the concept of the United States is still, like, we still think of ourselves largely as a very, like, isolated place. We are this, like, amazing country here that, other people want to come to and want the goodies that we have, et cetera. And we can understand why, because it's amazing, but there isn't an understanding that we're an empire, and there's so many books now by scholars about how to hide an empire. That's a great book, all these books about the reality is that we have been so intimately involved in people's day-to-day lives in other countries, right? The whole axiom of, like, we are here because you were there. So when basically our foreign policy decides, colludes with the elites of, let's just say, El Salvador, then people in that country, their entire lives have been partly determined by our foreign policy. And so as this incredible legal scholar at UCLA, Professor Achume, she writes about, essentially, when people arrive at the border, they're actually already a part of our political community because their lives have been so determined by our foreign policy, by what our companies have done in their countries. So they're not actually foreigners, is the idea. And I really recommend her work. I feel like her work should be must reading, but they are law review articles. I know not everybody wants to sign up for like 80 pages of like law review articles, but her work is really amazing because she's really helping us to think through what does it mean to be part of a political community.
I think your book captures that point really nicely too. And for those who don't have time for law review articles as well. And I also think, you point out that when we think about we talk about that sort of truly historic numbers of migrants under the Biden administration, which arguably politically, set the table for now. When we look for root reasons why, we're looking at, there was this change in asylum policy, or, over there's just but again, very little mention of U.S. foreign policy. So maybe walk us through, like, even just one country that was a major source of migration during that time. Like, what is the full connection between us and that country?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when we just look at Venezuela, right, we look at it as though that country just had the bad luck, of getting certain leaders. But the U.S. has sanctioned, has embargoed, has literally tried to change the government of that country. Before we went in and literally took out the president, we've actually been waging economic warfare on that country. Cuba is very, very similar history. And so we actually have not collaborated in certain ways. We haven't supported the people of these countries, but then we're surprised when their economies completely tank and people start to flee. But we created those conditions. The same thing, I know Cuba really well because of my family history, but the same thing with Cuba. We have not had, serious diplomatic relationships with them since the 1960s, early 1960s, right? And then we're surprised that people leave in waves and waves. When the Soviet Union came apart, we got a huge wave of Cubans that arrived in the aftermath of that. And then we enacted policies to try to close the door at that time. I mean, we just go back and forth with all these places.
NAFTA comes to mind. as well,
NAFTA
another
is
big
huge.
moment when there's a huge, there's a huge surge.
Yeah, and NAFTA was what I saw in my community because I grew up in a small town in New Jersey where it was all textile and kind of factories. My parents worked in factories there, and then literally we saw, all these factories like one by one start to shut down as companies took these jobs out, actually took them to Mexico or took them to different parts of Asia, very slowly over time. But we got to the point where my father lost his factory job and ended up working in the service sector. And part of what I write about, I don't talk too much about this in the book, but it was sort of, recognizing like our life would not be possible, even if my parents had come in the 90s because of those factory jobs being gone already by that point.
Yeah. And I think that's also where it just depends on what year your family happens to want to be here. You're essentially entering a completely different system.
Absolutely.
And different rules, and they're constantly changing. I want to talk a little bit more about sort of what we're seeing now, too, in Minneapolis, because I was really struck in the public reaction how much people talked about citizenship, right? So Alex Party, Renee Good, they're citizens, or there are citizens being not quite accidentally, they're being picked up, right? And that the status of the person became really important for people to think about whether an action was just or not. And I'm just curious what you feel like, as you watched all of that play out too, what do you feel like we've learned about citizenship from Minneapolis?
Yeah, I tell people that despite the title of my book, I really hope you will stop talking about citizens and that you will instead talk about neighbors, coworkers, friends, people that live in your community. Because even though the emphasis on citizen is meant to say, hey, a line has been crossed, it really, unfortunately, reinforces the notion that some lives should be saved and protected in certain ways based on a piece of paper that you have. But what it's shown us is what the philosopher Hannah Hernández said so famously, that, like citizenship is the right to have rights. So if you don't have a government to protect your rights, your citizenship is meaningless.
Yeah.
And that's what we saw in Minneapolis, right? That citizenship didn't matter. It was, to me, it was really incredible to see that unfold, and people's, not only in Minneapolis, but other parts of the country, just to see people, on social media screaming, I'm a citizen, because, as early as, more than a year ago, there was a woman at the U.S.-Mexico border who came into the country, a U.S. citizen who came with her German boyfriend. He was detained, I think, for several weeks. She also was detained for a few hours, handcuffed to a bench, and she was screaming, I'm a citizen. So I think for a lot of us, right, and maybe many of us who haven't thought about it, we're being confronted with the reality that what has been done to immigrants now for so many years, everything that's happening now to citizens has been happening to immigrants in detention centers. It's coming home, right? Like you can't like limit political violence from a government to just one community. It will eventually seep beyond that community too.
And I think also sort of the racialized nature of citizenship, right? Because certainly it's crossed my mind. I live in the DC area where there were National Guard troops. There is no centralized database of citizens, right? So they can't, if ICE pulls you over, there's not like a computer they can enter your name and just double check if you're in the database. And so how would you prove? And I think there were even photos I saw of people, I think in Minneapolis, wearing a passport around their neck. Right, so they don't have to reach into a pocket, and they can say, the passport becomes your proof. But I think it again shows how thin that proof ultimately can be.
And they have multiple databases that they're checking you against, and obviously they're doing biometrics now as well. It's a very, very scary time.
Yeah. You also, there's a passage I wanted to read that really struck me, which wanted you to tell us more about. Many people complain these days about the divisiveness of political life in the United States, as if it were only a matter of disagreeing over policies and values, when it could be said that we are at odds with one another because we do not live in the same country. We do not have the same citizenship. I think this is very much what you're just talking about.
And I mean, it's literally what the Supreme Court has told us, right? The Supreme Court decision has literally told us that, if a DHS agent hears me speaking in Spanish, if I am like coming out of a Home Depot, if I look Latina to them, they can detain me, they can stop me and question me and hold me for however long, right? The Supreme Court has literally told us that racist stops are legal now. So I don't have the same citizenship as someone who would not be identified. Again, it's also like who a DHS agent thinks is Latino in that moment, right? So I don't have the same citizenship. I don't have the same experience of the U.S. as someone who doesn't look like me or doesn't speak Spanish or wouldn't be in a certain kind of location. So yeah, we are absolutely citizens of different countries right now.
And also that wasn't true before that Kavanaugh
Yeah.
decision, right? So even the nature of your own citizenship has changed,
It wasn't.
perhaps?
It wasn't legal. I mean, I think it would still happen, right? Obviously, like even before that, right? ICE and Border Patrol were going into Los Angeles County and clearly targeting people who they were reading as Latino and people who were working. Like, I mean, Sonia Sotomayor, I hope that someone, I don't know if there's any book people, but I really hope that all her decisions are being collected into one book, because her decision in the Kavanaugh in this court decision, was incredible, because she pointed out, like, oh no, it's not like ICE is just stopping people and saying, hey, are you a citizen or not? Okay, thank you. She's like, no, they are harassing people. And in fact, in LA, they went back to the same mechanic shop like 4 different times to harass people. So it wasn't, it was happening, right? It's been happening for a long time, but it didn't have the legal stamp of the Supreme Court that you can do this. So that is different. That's dramatically different. But racism has never, died in the U.S. In fact, part of what I discuss in the book is citizenship becoming a proxy for race, right? So that now people can, whether it's your neighbor at the city council or some higher up politician can say, I'm not racist. I just think, they should follow the rules and not come here, right? So a lot of scholars have talked about this, that citizenship has become this, we can't have racist policy at the border, so we'll just say we don't want that citizen from that country.
Yeah, it just feels like we're at a moment where citizenship is not really a piece of paper so much as what you look like to somebody who's looking for people who are non-citizens.
And it never has been, but it's in our faces, right? And it's having dramatic consequences now.
Yeah.
The way it's being enforced has changed, right?
But you write about, in California, there's this kind of big political moment. So there's this Proposition 187. I don't know if people remember this, where it's pretty much the most aggressive law of maybe any state had ever passed, saying if you're undocumented, you can't get health care at a hospital.
You wouldn't be able to get health care.
Non-emergency care, whatever that means.
You wouldn't be able to go to K through 12 schooling. You wouldn't be able to study. Your teacher, I mean, that was the part that was really scary to me. Your teacher would have to report you if she thought that you, her kindergartner, were undocumented.
Yeah. And so this is like peak 90s.
Yeah.
I mean, the kind of world that Stephen Miller comes up in, which I think is totally impossible to not make that connection. So, but you mentioned in the book that after this, there's actually a real change in the politics of the state, and that millions of new voters register, many of them Latino, Asian Americans. Mm-hmm. Do you think, is that a potential, model or example of what might come out of a moment like this, do you think?
So always hard to speculate about the future. I certainly think the evidence is there for that to happen, not just based on 1994, but even now. I was talking with a Lyft driver yesterday who's Venezuelan, and he's like, He's like, no, if the election, if Trump was getting, was up for election now, he would be out. He's like, Latinos are really upset with him. I was like, yes, we are. So I think, yes, perhaps, but I think that what is important to remember is that is also the same time period that gave us Stephen Miller, right? Mm-hmm. So just 1994 and the opposition to Prop 187 gave us the California that we have now, which is 3 times as many Latinx folks on their state legislature, a blue state in a lot of ways with red pockets, but blue state overall. And so people look at that and go, wow, this is really amazing. But it also gave us, Stephen Miller is just a stand-in for a lot of people who feel like him as well and have very intense racist ideologies. And so I think this time period is also going to give us that as well. Yeah. I don't think we're going to get immigrant communities standing up and fighting back. But we're certainly going to get I'm running into so many more people who are absolutely trying to pursue, who might have been happy on a green card, indefinitely and are now trying to naturalize, and that was true after the first Trump administration as well.
I mean, to your point, they just passed a huge budget increase for Border Patrol, ICE, all of it. And so actually, we don't quite really know what the future holds with that level of funding, which I
Yeah.
think they've always been, they argue, underfunded, right? And so that size of bureaucracy around deportation, we've actually just never seen it.
Yeah.
And so I don't know if you have thoughts on kind of how that might continue to change the meaning of citizenship in this country.
Yeah, I mean, Border Patrol has been the largest policing agency after New York City's police department for a long time, not just since this increase, right? So funding for enforcement, I mean, that was something that was surprising to me about the 1965 Immigration Act, which is that we think of it as the family reunification moment, but it was also that was also legislation that for the first time put numerical limits on who could come here from Latin America, which sounds surprising because you're thinking, no, there was border enforcement before there, and there was, but there weren't limits on how many people could come. And so initially it was like 120,000 people from the whole region, and then it became, okay, only 20,000 people from each country. And you might be thinking, 20,000 people from Mexico, that might work. But at the time, it was something like 40,000 people were coming every year from Mexico, so the numbers were off. So I mean, we just have this intense history of opening the door, closing the door, opening the door, closing the door. I think what's different right in this moment is the level of brutality that is being waged on different communities.
Yeah. And to that point, also the luring of people for labor, right? I mean, and that in a way, I wonder if you have thoughts, is that in part why we don't give citizenship, right? To be cynical about it.
Yeah.
If you need cheap labor, it's easier to control a labor force that has fewer rights. And so is the economic need for this labor class part of why we have all of these different levels of citizenship?
Yeah, absolutely. You write so beautifully about this in your book as well, right? The Chinese Exclusion Act being put into play, and others there were people who wanted exclusion of Mexicans, except the agricultural businesses in the Southwest and Texas and California immediately put a stop to that because they wanted that labor, that cheap labor, and they also wanted to send them home, when it's done, right? When we don't need you, we want to go home. Something that, and we're talking in really modern terms, but part of what I loved about digging into the history of this country was like, nothing is new. This is what the historians are always telling us, and they are right. So even going back to the late 1700s, when we're like a new country, I write in one of the chapters about New England area, where basically poor people who would work on farms, they would hire themselves out, right, during harvest, right? And then once harvest was done, they would basically get deported. And you might be thinking like, well, wait, where's like the white person in the Bronx being deported to? They're being deported to Rhode Island because that was considered their home country where they had grown up, their settlement at the time. And so it wasn't called deportation, it was called warning out. You would be warned out of your community. So we have just, in terms of labor and when we want people and when we want their work, but not them, we've been doing that since the beginning. That was like, 1787.
Yeah. So I'd love to turn to questions from the audience, and if people want to keep adding some, please do. Start with this first one. Is there any country doing citizenship right?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. I mainly focus on what's happening in the United States, but, I don't think that there is a right way to do it. There's just different ways of doing it. And so some countries, if you live in certain places for like 5 years, you become eligible for citizenship. That sounds great to me. So there's sort of like different ways of doing it, but those countries don't always necessarily have birthright citizenship. So goody for us that we still currently have it till at least April 1st, when Supreme Court will be hearing arguments about the 14th Amendment. So I wouldn't say that there's any one particular right way to do it, just that it's a question of how open you are or not. And then as you may have been hearing, Spain just decided to grant a pathway to citizenship for like 500,000 immigrants, right? So I would also say what's more, I wouldn't say it's right, but really common is we're not the only country that's adjusting to the political moment. Other countries adjust, and they do adjust poorly. So I know you asked me like, who's doing it right? And I'm like telling you who's doing it wrong. But I think these are important warnings. So the Dominican Republic in 2010 revised its constitution to take away birthright citizenship from the children of undocumented immigrants, really targeting their Haitian communities. And then they made it retroactive to like the 1920s. So they made thousands of people stateless, which is for us a warning possibly of what could happen here in the US if the Supreme Court decides that the children of undocumented immigrants are not US citizens. We could be heading in some kind of direction like that.
Yeah, and the rules, I mean, the entire point of your book in many ways is the rules are constantly changing. Yeah. Today, the government says you're a citizen, and tomorrow you may not be.
Canada actually also just changed its citizenship.
Oh, how so?
This might be important, actually, for some of you in the audience. You historically could only claim citizenship one generation, so your parents would have to be Canadian citizens to claim you. Now you can go back further to grandparents, to great-grandparents. So a lot of people, they are getting, they have quite a generous archive, especially in Quebec. So if any of you think you might have some Canadian ancestry, this is the time to go. I mean, they said that like from January of last year to I think they said something like in January of last year, their archives, which is basically you have to go back and get the birth certificate of this ancestor or their marriage license or things like that. I think they said something like last January they maybe had like 50 requests, and now it's in the thousands. They're just completely submerged. So everything's slowing down on their end, of course, because laws change all the time.
Yeah. Another person asked, what are the risks, if any, of having open U.S. borders? And I guess to be specific, open U.S. borders for people, not the companies that you referred to earlier.
That is a wonderful question. I don't think there's any risks. I'm not being Pollyanna about it, but, people are people. So, you get people in the country who are amazing, just as like you get birthright citizens. Have you checked recently? Like that, the question for me was like, it's like, well, what are the risks of birthright citizens? It's sort of like, in our community we have amazing people, and then we have a people like whoever the hell just like smashed the car window, like my car window and my neighbors this past week and got nothing out of our cars. Not this past week, this happened a while ago, but there's just sort of like, difficult situations in every community. So I don't see it as being risky. Also, because let's keep in mind, part of the reason it's not, I don't think it's risky, I'm not being Pollyanna about it, part of the reason it's not risky is because of what the economists tell us. Okay, the economists, econ people, there might be some in the room, you're typically pretty conservative, right? You think very prudently about these things. And what you tell us is that actually immigrants want to go to countries where there's a lot of work. So if there isn't work, if there isn't opportunity, if you can't make a good life, you actually just skip it. And go elsewhere. So we're not coming here because people aren't coming here because they just watched a bunch of Hollywood movies, right? They're coming here because their brother's here and he has a good job, right? And so he thinks he's gonna get that. Or, I became good friends with an immigrant family in Chicago. They have one sibling in New York and another sibling in LA. And they're like, we're not leaving Chicago. Like you can buy a car here that you can't buy in LA because it's much more expensive. Like you could buy a little home out somewhere here that you could never have in New York City. So people go where there's opportunity. So it's not me. It's just what the economists are telling us.
I think also we sometimes forget with the border, right, when it was more porous.
Yep.
And there was a lot of seasonal labor,
Yes.
people would sort of go back and forth.
Yep.
And once the border became harder, people were sort of forced to pick a side, right? And so we sort of
Absolutely.
can't imagine. I mean, we don't. No one actually knows what would happen, but we shouldn't pretend. But what we don't remember sometimes is that when people can't go back and forth with a more porous border, they kind of just are stuck here, almost in hiding. Because they don't have the alternative of doing something else.
Yeah.
And so we should not presume, in all of U.S. history, many immigrants go back home. Like a lot of people, sometimes I think this like America's the best is another version of American exceptionalism, that everybody just wants to be here. I guess you're right, the movies make it sound so, and they never want to go back. And a lot of immigrants, I think, do end up, they don't want to be here permanently. They want to work for a time and go back or whatever it is. And there's just a lot of different versions of this that change when the border gets harder.
And part of what's happening right now, and I think this is going to be really fascinating, like if I was going to write a part 2 to the book, which is really fascinating, are young people who are choosing to go to their home countries. So there's a social media influencer who decided basically, that's it, like I'm out, undocumented. She's like, you know what, I am a citizen. I'm a citizen of Mexico. I'm going. She has, a lot of media and marketing skills. So she's basically setting herself up as an entrepreneur in Mexico, and now she's doing all these videos telling people like, why are you staying in the US? You've got mad skills. Come on, girl, And she's basically talking about, starting her life there. And part of what she's saying that was really fascinating, that I think is going to be just amazing to follow, is that many of us we grew up as the kids of immigrant families who were really poor. They were working class. They came here to work in factories or in the service sector or things like that. And so our concept of our home country was that it was only about poverty, because that's what our parents experienced. But what this young woman is putting up on social media is like, wait, I can be middle class here in Mexico, like not just in the US. Hello. And she's like, and I'm super bilingual, right? So she's got all those skills. People want to hire her because she's culturally fluent in English. So I think it's going to be kind of like, this kind of goes back to like, what could this political moment lead to? I mean, part of what it's leading to right now are some young people saying, I'm going to go have my amazing middle class life in what was my home country, and where like maybe I was when I was like a year old.
Yeah.
And what does that do to the local economies there? I don't know, you know, but yeah.
And also kind of what the Trump administration wants to have happen. I mean, they want people to decide to go back.
Yeah.
Let's see. Someone asks, one of the many places we're seeing these questions of citizenship play out is in academia. Another is in the arts. How have you seen this playing out at Northwestern, where you stand at the intersection of academia and the arts?
Yeah, this is the moment where I say I do not speak on behalf of my university. These views are my own, et cetera, et cetera. I should have that phrase memorized by now. It's a very, very difficult time in higher ed. I've not seen anything like it before. And part of it I describe in the book was realizing that I thought McCarthyism was a historical moment, rather something that could happen again. So particularly when our students began to come out in support of Palestine and Palestinian lives, and to speak out against the genocide, what I really saw in higher education, it still continues, is just this enormous backlash, to the point that faculty members were just very much more easily investigated than they would have ever had been before. What they're teaching being brought into question. It's been really, really hard, just the level of silencing and questions that come up, because you start to think about, okay, what am I bringing into the classroom, I had a student who bypassed the internal report. So there's an internal reporting system to every college, of course. I had a student who bypassed that and just went to like some hate group to report me. So we have students doing that. Some are going internally and some are just going to the outside groups. In our case, it's been very disheartening because our board of trustees, this is being filmed, right? Anyway, our board of trustees and our university president do not listen in the ways that I had hoped to faculty. So what we have done is we have written all the letters. We have brought ourselves together in faculty assembly and voted against, collaboration with the Trump administration. But nevertheless, our university still agreed to sign an agreement with the Trump administration, agreeing to many things in order to get back funding. And it's still not clear to many of us on the faculty what money we actually have gotten back. Because DEI is still considered to be illegal. It's still a very dismal state of affairs, and it's not getting better.
Has this affected how you teach?
It does affect how I teach because I really think about, I think through what I bring into the classroom. So, for example, last year when I taught a graduate class, I brought in a Palestinian memoir, and I gave a lot more explanation for my pedagogical reasons for teaching the Palestinian memoir that I would have never had done 5 years ago. I had to also meet one-on-one with students who were really upset for different reasons in that classroom, which is not, I don't think were conversations I would have had like 5 years ago, but yeah.
Yeah. In your experience, what has been the most effective way to make people empathize or change their perceptions about immigration?
That's a wonderful question. Part of what I write in the book is that those conversations with my cousin, an immigrant himself, about immigrants was the shocking moment was realizing that he didn't need more factual information, that it wasn't a lack of information or a lack of knowledge. And so you can have conversations with people, but I do think it's an important moment to recognize that the conversation won't go any further, that they are very attached to what they believe in, and that it's not, these aren't policy disagreements. And part of how I explain a policy disagreement is we have $2 million. Maybe I think we should use that to pay our school teachers more, and you think we should put it into the small business initiative. Okay, that's a disagreement, and we can argue about that. But whether our government should be allowed to murder people in broad daylight or in the middle of the night, as they did in Texas a year ago, and we're just finding out about it now. They killed a young man in Texas. That's not like a political disagreement, like the way the $2 million and where that's not sort of these are now we're in the arena of morality, or whatever term you want to use. I feel like we're in the field of what's a moral decision. And so I compare it to the fact that we reached a point as a country where we decided that we were no longer going to accept the lynching of Black Americans. That doesn't mean that everyone agreed with that decision. And it obviously doesn't mean that the killing of Black men stopped, but we don't have lynching the way we had that, right? And so to me, that's now in this arena that's different. That's not politics anymore. To me, that now feels like a moral decision. Do I want to live in a country where my government or my neighbor can murder whoever they want because of their race or their religion or their country of origin or their language or whatever it is? To me, that's really different. So I think part of what and I write about this in the book, is that we have to confront our own grief. I heard a minister recently from Minneapolis talk about tending to our grief, and I think a lot of us are bypassing our grief to try to get to a solution. But part of it is just grief is hard, and just the despair of sitting with wow, it's really hard. My cousin does believe the government should have a right to kill X number of people for a political cause. He does believe that. He does embrace that. He's not alone in that. And I had to sit through my own grief with that. And then I think, you don't hang out in grief forever, right? You come to book events, you go protest, right? You go volunteer, you do whatever it is that you want to do in your community that you think is going to be helpful. But it also means that we can work with a clearer head, if we're not mired in the grief and wanting it to be different and so forth.
Yeah. I'll close with just one last question, which is, what do you think is the most misunderstood idea about citizenship?
The most misunderstood idea is that that it's a fixed thing, and that it's one thing, and that I'm a citizen and hence I should be protected in all these different ways. That it's somehow intrinsic to the term of citizen, when really it's we're at the it's basically the moment that we're in decides what citizenship means right now.
Well, thank you, Daisy. Thank you, all of you, for coming.